Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. For those who don't know, my name is Andrew Hodkinson, and every week, 6 p.m. Jerusalem time, put out a teaching, just encourage people in their faith from a Messianic Hebrew roots perspective. So feel free to subscribe if you want to join this channel. This week, we are looking at 3 Passovers, ? Going to delve into the actual sacrifice, the meat sacrifice connected to the Exodus, the bread and the wine that Yeshua he brought out on the night he was betrayed, and then finally look at his sacrifice itself as in connection to the Passover, just so we can well discern distinction between these different things, because often they do get merged and just get abused and twisted. Now, just in terms of the timing, just be aware that it's quite a debated thing, hotly debated. Many congregations are divided over this issue. I get excited that people are just doing the Passover right more and more. But there seems to be an issue with Yeshua's timing and perhaps the majority of the Jewish people the next day around a passage called Pesachim 5b, a Sadducean and Pharisee dispute there, Sadducees being a bit earlier. Now, some may not agree with that assessment, but some, like Larry Hurtado, done a lot of work looking at the quartodeciman practice, and that's just in reference to the earliest of Christians and how they did Passover. He wrote this: the quartodeciman celebration, and that means 14th, because you keep the Passover on the 14th. Of the Passover on the 14th day of Nisan is a striking testimony to the fact that these communities retained the Jewish calendrical system in its original form, in keeping with the ancient method of reckoning the day as attested by the Talmudic dispute in Pesachim 5b, what we just looked at, where the Sadducees insisted on an earlier start. These Christians observed the Passover in a way that is reminiscent of the older pre-Pharisaic tradition. This is debated, but we definitely get a sense of in the Synoptic Gospels, certainly on a Pashat, a plain reading, that in some way Messiah intended to eat the Passover on the night he was betrayed. And this opens up ideas of, well, was this a new expression in bread and wine? Is it referring to that? Is it just a wish fulfillment type language? I may do this. But I don't want that to distract from the importance of the rite, that actually the Exodus offering would have been still, whether it was fulfilled in whatever ways, it still was a meal that was done with great significance in the early church. I got a Roman, I don't think he's a church father, but a historian saying, for they, the apostles, continued to observe the worship of the law, and they did not hesitate to worship in the temple, keeping the feasts of the Jews. Okay. Perhaps after the cross we would maybe refer to it as the feasts of Greater Israel, but anyway, but we get the idea, and were zealous in the law of Moses. So this is important. So let's look at firstly the meal that was eaten in remembrance of Exodus, of that Exodus generation. And I've got a great quote here from Baruch Levine, so a good son of Levi, we would imagine, and in his JPS commentary, it's the first thing to realize about the Passover ordinance. He wrote the phrase "before the Lord," Lepni Yehovah, consistently refers to sacrifices brought before the divine presence, which in Deuteronomic and priestly tradition means at the sanctuary or altar. However, the Passover is exceptional. So there's an exception to the rule. It is to be sacrificed in the place that he will choose. A phrase used uniquely in Deuteronomy to refer to Jerusalem as a city-wide designation rather than the precise location of the altar. So what's important to firstly just understand is that the Passover rite is a household meal. It was a sacrifice or slaughtering, a butchering to eat meat, and this was done on a kind of broader level. First thing, just to understand. But when we go to Exodus chapter 12, it's important to discern the passages about the Pesach, or what's called the Passover. They are Exodus 12, 1 to 13, verses 21 to 28, and then verses 42 to 50. You get the description of the Passover as a sacrifice. So like you had the sin offering, the peace offering, various offerings of the temple, so you had a Passover offering. And Tyndale did a really good translation here for us, in that it's related to the word where it says, and he would passa the houses of Israel. He would pass over. But you also get that sense of in judgment. So you could call it the sparing offering or the exemption offering. But this was really done on a household level. I want you to really just understand that, and it's a beautiful thing to partake in as families. Philo says this, and this is a first century Jew writing in this way. Now, at the Passover festival, all the people of Israel take part in the sacrificial rites, and they offer their sacrifices not with the help of priests, it's important, but by themselves, offering them as if they themselves were priests. And this commemorates the time when they were delivered from Egypt. And so really there's a sense of what God was talking about. You shall be a kingdom of priests. There are these elements where Israel in particular, and those that wish to bind into Israel, are elevated to priestly roles. And so it's almost like the hearth in the old kitchens became as the altar, and the head of the household as a priest, or everyone, priests eating. And that's also connected with the unleavened bread of the rite, just so you know that, because a lot of the majority of sacrifices would be eaten and have the consuming of unleavened bread. Yeah, I think it's a travesty what happened in the temple, where it was taken away from this household level, and this was more Pharisaic interpretation, where they had, between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, they would have, Josephus says it's 250,000 lambs were slaughtered, 250,000. Most people think that's an exaggeration. Maybe at the height, 100,000. And some think it's grossly exaggerating, and it's more around 23,000 or something like that. But anyway, the priests would, even though the Sadducees are more connected with the priests would have to do the bidding of the Pharisees, who controlled the synagogue. We get what they would do. The high priests, upon the coming of the feast, which is called the Passover, they slay the sacrifices from the 9th hour till the 11th. And at this time, especially at the time of Yeshua, we definitely get the sense of the Pharisees gaining in popularity and strength, political strength. It was just getting more and more till the eventual destruction of the temple. Josephus would also say the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace obsequious to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. But just so you know, that this really it's this rite that is the Passover that commemorates coming out of Egypt. And this is the essential Passover rite that we've been reading of. It isn't a day, it isn't technically a week, it isn't even the meal, it's the meat. You shall eat it, the Passover, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. It's very much about the name of a sacrifice. The second thing, another thing that kind of people seek to replace the Passover, and we've just got to get a bit careful with it, is that of the bread and wine. And the problem is that we've lost, as a people, as Messianic believers, as people who put their trust in Yeshua as the Messiah, we've lost the bias of always trying to root things in the Tanakh, that we should, even things like baptism, that really there's a tradition by which we understand the passing through the waters and the washing, as it were. Um, Even the idea of synagogues, where it says in Acts, for Moses has read in the synagogues in every city. Synagogues as well. We can root that through the Psalms. We see that the description there of the moeds, or the places where people would honor God and sacred spaces, maybe not the temple, but to root everything in an original practice. And when it comes to bread and wine, many people just think this is a new thing, and that's a bad assumption. And very few people know this, but Jews, the Jewish nation for long has been, and I'm not saying many traditions I think have been added, but I think this one isn't. They have this tradition um, of bread and wine. They have, before the Sabbath, they do something called Kiddush to sanctify the day. And they, in a ceremonial household manner, they break bread and drink wine. And they themselves actually say that this is very ancient, going back to the Second Temple period, that this practice goes back to there. I don't think we should stop there, personally, because but they don't want any suggestion of this has anything to do with sacrifice. But knowing that bread and wine were poured on the altar, and you got Melchizedek bringing bread and wine to Abraham, there's good reason to believe that this is a really ancient practice done on a household level and continued through the ages, and Yeshua would just bring it to the surface in the fullness of time and saying, do this in remembrance of me. Now, is he a Passover? Yes. Is he the Passover? In a sense, yes. Now, to say this is bread and wine is the new Passover meal, we need to push back on that and just realize, no, it is in remembrance, done in remembrance of his sacrifice, and that there are many fulfillment levels that come through his sacrifice, not just the Passover, the Paschal, as said in the Latin. Now, so when people try and do this competitive thing that, well, we had the Passover, but, the ultimate Passover, we really need to reject this kind of competitive idea. This is adding meaning to an already existing practice. And we see, and we must not limit it to just whatever fulfillment we see of him in terms of Passover. We see him as the bronze serpent lifted up. Cursed is the man who is hung on a tree. We see him in Isaiah 53 is described as our sin offering and our peace. We can see through his cousin calling him, behold the Lamb. He is, when I see the bread and the cup, I think we ought to think of the one who carried his own wood, to his own destruction, or meant for his own destruction, as with Isaac, and the ram with the caught in the thorns. There's multiple things, not just the Passover, and multiple streams of fulfillment and typology that we can get from the bread. It does not have to compete. It points to him and the fullness of all that he represents. So we need to be just careful on saying these are new substitutionary things to make obsolete prior ordinances. Okay, and then the final one uh, with regards to Messiah being our Passover, and this is true without a doubt. Paul would say, cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump. This is 1 Corinthians is just all about the spring season, and it's just beautifully written. As you really are unleavened, for Christ, the anointed one, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. And he goes on to say, let us therefore celebrate the festival. But anyway, we get this description of Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. And again, this is used in a competitive way that, it's no longer that. It's meant to be this way. And we've got to really be careful with this issue and realize that uh, we've got to be very careful with using type and antitype. And Paul's clearly talking in terms of typology because he's not a lamb and he wasn't sacrificed, he was executed. He wasn't burnt, his blood wasn't, treated as sacred, perhaps until the most final part. But there is so much that is just not in keeping with the Passover. And this we know is that Passover, the thing with typology is that it is never exact, and people manipulate people by trying to make things exact where we don't know. And the general rule, just so you understand, is that we do things according to how Moses wrote the command, and afterwards you try and see the typology. Otherwise, you will have the tail wagging the dog, and people will say this part has to be fulfilled in this way. And I keep saying, says who? So if someone says, Messiah cannot eat the Passover and be the Passover, it's like, says who? Or he had to be, again, says who? There are multiple things, and if anything, the most literal thing that he was fulfilling during the day was Genesis 15 with the idea of a cursed corpse offering, the punishment of the one who walked between the corpses and having to be treated in that way. But nothing is exact with typology, and don't let people manipulate you with making literalisms that don't have to be like that. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. But to really understand the rule that yes, he's our Passover. Of course he is. He is the Passover. I mean, what does it mean? It means to passar. It means to exempt. He is the ultimate exemption. He will be that as an antitype, as the one to which the greater level on which all of these things point. And so, yes, he is our Pesach, he is our Pesach, but we need to be careful with literalisms and how we understand the fulfillment of these things. So I do want to end with this, again, from a Roman Catholic. So, if they speak in this way, then we know we are in good company. Eusebius, again, talking about the early believers, talking about the early apostles. That's why I like to speak of Yeshua and Yochanan and the others in a Jewish context that people really understand. This is the commonwealth of Israel going out. It is not some new Greco-Roman Anglo-Saxon expression. We've got to root it in Moses and the prophets. Now the church in Jerusalem, which was established by the apostles, was composed chiefly of men of the Jewish race. They kept the Sabbath and the feast and did not cease from the observance of the law of Moses. I think that really does point to they kept the Passover right. They would have had new fullness and understand the bread and the wine, and more importantly, they did not allow typology with regards to the Messiah and how he fulfilled those holy days to change how it was written in Moses. And they were quartodecimans. That can be debated on how they did the 14th. But the point is this, and I hope this is the main thing I can encourage you with, is that that you open your minds to an ancient rite that's really been void in the Christian church for ages, but it can be done on a household level. A bitter meal, eaten with bitter herbs, and but fully in keeping with the season and everything it represents, and we can be mindful of. And so I really pray that this may help you come back to the roots of your faith and the calendar of our faith as we are wrestling with these things. So many blessings. Shabbat Shalom to you all. Until next week. Bye.